Independent Producers Organization live showcase. And today we have an edition to do with overpopulation, and I have a call in from Frosty Woldridge. Let me introduce him. He's bicycled across 6 continents, from the Arctic to the South Pole, as well as 8 times across the United States, coast to coast and border to border. In 2005, he bicycled from the Arctic Circle, Norway to Athens, Greece. In 2012, he bicycled coast to coast across America. He presents the coming population crisis facing America and what to do about it. And it can't possibly be anything more important than this. Frosty, are you there?
I certainly am, Richard. I'm really happy to be with you and all listeners, not only across the Northwest, but across America and Canada. So I'm excited about a conversation today that's most left out in the mainstream media, and that's the crisis that America faces as it is about to add 138 million more people within the next 34 years.
People just don't realize how serious this is. I've got a newspaper here. I know you can't see it. It's a local paper, the Tribune, and it's got a thing here. It says, "City choked by traffic and congestion." And I'm not trying real hard to get it, so everybody just trust me, that's what it says. A city choked by traffic and congestion. Frosty, can you imagine what might be causing that?
Well, let me really bring this home to those who have not heard about this in the past. We right now in the United States, just in the last 45 years, added 100 million people. And that was jumping our population from 194 million back in 1963, when the 1965 Immigration Reform Act manifested through Howard Metzenbaum and Jacob Javits and Teddy Kennedy back in 65. They then started immigrating into the country. Instead of 175,000 people per year, they started immigrating 1.2 million per year. And by 2006, that jumped our population to 300 million. Right now, at the growth rate of 3.1 million per year, we're on course to jump from the 300 million in 2006 to 438 million people by 2050. That's only 34 years from now.
Yeah.
That means, in real terms, we're going to double the populations of our 35 most populated cities. So New York City will jump from 8.3 million to 16.6 million. Chicago, Illinois, from 5 million to 10 million. Los Angeles, from 11 million to 22 million. The state of Florida is now projected to grow from 18 million to 36 million. And please, dear listener, fellow American, Canadian, and world traveler, we are already with 7 states that are in water shortages, starting off with Florida and Georgia and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada, and obviously California is in an exceptional drought, and yet California is on course again to add 20 million more people, and 98% of that population gain will come from legal and illegal immigration. So the goal here, Richard, is to create a national discussion and debate on where we want to take our civilization, how we want to hand it over to future generations. And of course, my thrust and my theme throughout all of this is to shut down all immigration into the United States, help those people in their own countries, because the fact is the third world continues to grow at 80 million net gain, new babies every year, and thus they're not doing anything about their birth rates. So we need to take some action on our own in order to survive and actually thrive as a viable and sustainable civilization. I hope that sets the stage for this evening's conversation.
That's right. We have people like even Syria, especially Syria, because it really bothers a lot of people. Why can't they do this over there in their country? I don't know how they can be, so many people can be chased out by just a few guys with guns or whatever they have over there, but they should stay there and try to make the most out of that country. They've been doing it all this time, right up to now. So what happens all of a sudden now that they can't stay there in their country and make it work? Why do I have so many refugees have to be traveling to the, Spain, Germany, France, all those countries?
That's correct. And the reality is this, and I really want this to really sober each listener. Africa right now has 1.1 billion people. 1.1, B as in boy, 1.1 billion people. And by 2050, the United Nations projections for population show that Africa will reach 2 billion people because they simply will not engage family planning or birth control. And before the end of the century, which is only 84 years from now, which is the life of an American citizen about, they will hit 4 billion. So, in other words, they're not taking care of their responsibilities. And even with civil war, we had a civil war. We didn't have our own people racing off to other countries. We dealt with our civil war inside our country. And so at some point, no matter what, Syria and any of the citizens in all of the countries of Africa are going to have to deal with their birth rates and their own internal wars, because if they don't, and we continue to take on all of these immigrants, whether it's humanitarian or otherwise, we will then suffer the same consequences of an overloaded society with people fighting amongst themselves for water and energy and resources. So we have to ask ourselves, is this the path that we want to take? And as a world traveler, as you have seen on my bio, having bicycled across 6 continents and actually 11 times across the United States, traveled all over the world, I've already seen what has occurred in the world, and I'm really inviting all Americans and every person listening to raise your voice, and I'll give you some organizations from which you can do that in order to create this national debate, because I'm trying to get on 60 Minutes, I'm trying to get on Charlie Rose, I'm trying to get on NPR with Robert Siegel, I'm trying to get on TED Talks. And the key is that we've got to raise our voices. This is a constitutional republic. It doesn't wait for you to sit around and say nothing or do nothing. You have to take action in order to change the course of history. And so that's the reason for our discussion tonight.
What do they tell you when you call the radio and television stations? Do they say that people don't want to hear about not reproducing, or what specifically are they trying to get over to you as to why they don't want to do it?
Well, as a matter of fact, there is a national taboo on the topic of human overpopulation, especially here in the United States.
Right.
But the fact is we are the 3rd fastest growing country in the world behind China, which adds 8 million people net gain per year, even with a 1 child per family. And India, at 1.25 billion, adds 16 million people every single year net gain. And they will overcome China by the mid-century. But here, just like in India, there's no conversation, because there are other people with a different mindset, and those are the corporate heads, those are the power elites, those are the Catholic Church, that's the Islamic Church. And all of those entities want and expect and actually hope for endless immigration and more population so that they can create more growth in the industries, more car sales, more home sales, but they neglect to understand that this is a finite planet with finite resources, and that at some point it all comes down kind of like Humpty Dumpty off the wall and shatters, and that's what kind of a civilization we're working for right now. And those people with those kinds of mindsets need to have their mindsets changed by the action of we, the educated citizens of America. Otherwise, we're all facing the same thing that happened to the Roman Empire. Certainly for those of you who know about Easter Island was a finite area, and it collapsed after its citizens kept exponential growth going for centuries. and then the Mayan, the Mayan civilization there in Mexico, Central America, also collapsed. And when you see all these ruins, those are the ruins of overpopulated, unsustainable societies, and we are headed in the same direction at a gallop because of mass immigration.
China, of all things that you just talked about, China really sticks out in my mind because 120-mile gridlock, can the people not know? Hey, there must be a problem. There's too many of us. What do we do? I mean, they don't even comment about that.
Well, they certainly don't, and they're just like we are. They don't have an answer, but what they keep doing is building more lanes. And if any of you have seen any of the videos on the 120 plus mile gridlock traffic jams, they actually have to take food and water to the people through airlifts and helicopters just to pull them out of this thing because everybody runs out of gas. But in China today, and I've traveled all over China, they've got 50 lanes going one way. I don't know if anybody can even imagine that. 50 lanes going one way, and yet they still add 27 million cars. That was Neil Lester Holt on NBC. They add 27 million new cars to China's highways every year because at 1.35 billion people, the Chinese want to be like Americans, and they are racing pell-mell to do that. But there's no way to keep adding cars and homes in a finite area and hope to have any kind of quality of life. And the fact is, the rivers, like the Yangtze River, which I've sailed on, is an open sewer. And certainly the air pollution in China it's ubiquitous, and it's deadly, and it's toxic, and it causes lung cancer, and it causes emphysema, and it causes all the consequences of acid rain. And, of course, there's a 20,000 square mile dead zone at the mouth of the Yangtze River. So you can see there's no one's really working towards solutions. They just keep powering up the engines of consumption and production, and they're going to pay a severe price in the future.
I think their leadership knows what the problem is, but they don't know how to deal with it. I mean, human desire for reproduction is an overwhelming thing. It just, when I read about it, it says there's just nothing stops human reproduction. And that's their problem as much as anyone else's over there. So I'm not really sure myself. I think their leaders know, but I don't think you can convey it to the people as easily.
Well, that's true. At the same time, though, educated countries such as Canada, such as Europe, such as Australia, and such as America have had a 2.03 fecundity or birth rate since 1970. So educated countries like New Zealand, like Australia, like all of the countries of Europe have anywhere from a 1.3 to a 1.6 birth rate. So they chose, and here in the United States we have a 2.03 for the last 40 years per woman of children. And so we did intellectually choose, since 1970 when we had our first Earth Day, we chose to have a stable, sustainable civilization. However, the power elites in Congress that opened up the doors, the floodgates, if you will, Jacob Javits said, let's open up the floodgates, and the rest of the third world kept steaming ahead. When I was in college there in the 60s, we had 3.5 billion people on the planet. Well, now we've got 7.3 billion, growing by 80 million per year, and 1 billion net gain every 12 years, ready to hit 10 billion by the mid-century, and upwards of 14 billion before the century's over, and no one's talking about it. You cannot get onto Charlie Rose. You cannot get on 60 Minutes. They just won't touch all of the facts, the figures that I've sent them for the last 15 years. And so what I'm hoping is that everyone listening today sends a letter to 60 Minutes. And you know the email of 60 Minutes is 60M, as in minutes, 60m@cbsnews.com, and demand, invite, implore, beseech the the CBS 60 Minutes crew and the producers to run a series, or at least a a big expose on what our country faces if we continue on this path and add this next 100 million immigrants legally, and that's not counting the illegal ones, which could add anywhere from 20 to 30 million more. And of course, our own birth rate of it's called population momentum. Even at 2 children per family, we add and are about to add a total of 34 million more in the next 34 years, because we add about 1 million because of population momentum. So as you can see, it has to be you, the American citizen, that writes Charlie Rose and writes Matt Lauer and writes George Stephanopoulos and writes Wolf Blitzer and Britt Hume and certainly John Dickerson on Face the Nation and Meet the Press. The key is either we do that or this thing will be buried, because those in power do not want to stop population growth.
And a little more time, when a little more time passes, I don't know, years, I almost would have to say, you're going to go back to these guys, these Charlie Rose and all these, and they are going to realize, I think we screwed up. I think we didn't see the problem back then. We just wanted to take the easy route. More people, more better, more people, more better. That's what they really were thinking all the time. And therefore they don't want anything to interfere with that. They are also thinking, we want more people listening. Well, that's not all right. We're gonna, in time, it's gonna come back to them. Why didn't you do something back then? Why didn't you call our attention to this overpopulation situation? And by the way, it still comes back to immigration about as much as anything. I'm sure that's still the problem with us.
Well, that's correct. It is totally immigration. If it wasn't for immigration in 1965 being changed to the horrific number of 1.2 million per year, you would not have had the 100 million people added to this country. It would have balanced out, and we would have totaled, because of population momentum, we would have reached an equilibrium of 250 million by 1990. But instead, we screamed through that, and we're now at 324 million and growing again by 3.1 million per year. So we either take charge of this as a country, as a civilization, or we are going to pay, our children are going to pay the severe price and the consequences of becoming a new third world country where everybody is struggling for water. They're going to be struggling for energy. They're going to be struggling for resources which are not there, and they're going to be literally struggling for quality of life, which will not be there. Because
right.
I want you to understand this. Once the numbers land on our country, all we can do is suffer under those numbers. There's no solution. And I've heard many sit around and say, well, we've got technology is going to save us. Well, the fact is, technology will not save us, and it will not change the consequences of catastrophic climate destabilization. It won't stop the air pollution over our cities. It won't stop the consumption of energy and coal that then create smog and create air pollution, which then drops on the land and poisons the land, and therefore we won't survive all of the Monsanto GMOs. We won't survive the Weed Be Gone and the Roundup, which is killing all the pollinators. And you kill enough of the bees, you won't have crops to eat. And then when you start creating such poisonous soils we're now injecting 70,000 different chemicals into the air, into the water, into the land 24/7. At some point, those soils, the air and the water will break down to a point where you cannot recover nature itself or the natural world. And then when you start thinking about the species extinction rates at 250 per year here in the United States because of habitat encroachment by humans, and over 100 creatures worldwide go extinct every single day. That's the Norman Maier Oxford University research project that's been going on for 30 years. You've got huge problems with the ecosphere and our biosphere. You're looking at the oceans being literally contaminated and acidified, if you will, but also they're sucking up all that carbon, and at some point we're literally killing off the oceans, and that's where we have so much of our food supply. So this thing is compounding. It's called exponential growth. It cannot be sustained. It will, in the end, cost us as a civilization, and ultimately it's going to take this civilization on a road that we don't want to travel.
You know, the oil, taking one thing, you mentioned just energy, but think in terms of just oil. We're going to run out of it. Now they're going to figure out all kinds of ways, fracking, changing coal into oil, things that are not practical. It's so much easier just to have less people. But more important, oil will run out. And people don't realize when the oil was out, does anyone remember what it was like in about 1973 when we were low on gas and there were lines at service stations for blocks? Does anyone not remember that? Think of what it'll be like in the future when the oil is gone.
Well, that's
really
true. And
gone.
Walter Youngquist, the great energy expert, said, and I quote, "As we go from this happy hydrocarbon bubble,
Right.
we have reached now to a renewable energy resource economy, which we must do in this century. Will the civil part of civilization survive? As we both know, there is no way that alternative energy sources can supply the amount of per capita energy we now enjoy from oil, much less the 10 billion people expected by 2050. And energy is what keeps this game going. We are involved in a Faustian bargain, selling our economic souls for the luxurious life of the moment, but sooner or later the price has to be paid," unquote. That should really put a chill up everyone's spine, because we're not going to escape this Faustian bargain. And no matter how many elites up there and how many corporate heads and all the big capitalists that are pushing for more growth and endless population growth, the Faustian bargain will be paid for by our children. And if anybody is listening tonight and you're somewhere around the age of 30 or 40, you're going to be a part of that Faustian bargain debt that's going to come due as you get to be my age.
Yeah, in other words, when we're going to be out of oil, period. I mean, just driving around the city, endless cars everywhere. Traffic, again, on this page in the front, the Tribune, cars all over. There won't be the oil to supply those. It's just going to stop. Oh, there'll be some electricity. There are different ways to generate electricity. We like to think the dams can do it all, but I don't think they can. They could do it all if there's less people. If there were less people, the dams could probably supply all the energy we need. So that's part of our problem. I really feel that what some of these little people, little babies, that's what they're going to see when they get up to be 30 and 40 years old. Hey, where's the oil that you guys had?
That's exactly correct. As a matter of fact, there was a book out. It's called $20 per Gallon by a guy named Steiner out of Forbes. And he did a report on it, and I did a review on his book.
Okay.
And he said at some point we're going to go to $5 a gallon. In fact, I was in California last summer, and I took a picture of a pump on the Big Sur on my bicycle trip, and it was $5.99 a gallon. $5.99 a gallon. Well, guess what? It's going to go up to $10 a gallon. And ultimately, as it gets harder and harder, it takes more units of energy to get it out of the ground, and then more units of energy to get it, around to all the gas stations. It's going to be $20 a gallon. And so it's going to literally change the way we live and work and eat and play and how we operate. And we caused it to ourselves because we simply kept adding more and more people. And that's because the Congress, back in 1965, not knowing what it was going to do with the consequences, went ahead and created the Faustian bargain, and all of us are going to pay here in the very near future, because when you look at the next 30 years, they're going to go by in a blink, but we will be faced with the consequences, and at some point they will be irreversible and they'll be unsolvable.
But having less people really will be the biggest step that we can take. And how do we get word to families? In other words, it's whenever I hear someone say, "Well, we're going to get married and have a family," I'm thinking, "Well, wait a minute. How about one or no children? How about that?"
Well, there's a fantastic research done by a Dr. Jack Alpert, and I would encourage each of you listening tonight to go to www.skil.org, skil.org, with Dr. Jack Alpert. He's out of Stanford University, brilliant statistician, and he has shown mathematically that we cannot survive the 21st century with the way the oil is being used up. And let me everybody appreciate this. You all might think, well, we're going to have alternative energy, we're going to have technology. Well, here's the reality. Every day now, the human race burns 94 million barrels of oil. 94 million barrels of oil. And that oil, if you put it into your drums, that's 42 gallons per drum, and you have they're 20 inches in diameter, and you made a belt of those oil drums. That oil drum belt would reach around the equator and then some over 29,000 miles. And the equator is about 25,000 miles. The belt of oil would be another 29,000 miles of oil. Those oil drums are filled up every 12 o'clock at night, and for 24 hours they're all burned down. And in fact, not Africa, but China right now, growing at such an extraordinary exponential rate of speed, is projected by 2030, which is only 14 years from now, to be burning 98 million barrels of oil each day themselves. Yeah. So at some point, the Earth cannot and will not give up all that oil. And then the next fact is this. What does that much oil mean? Well, if you take all the oil burned today, it's around 30 billion barrels per year. For the sake of just a visual, that's a block, a metric block of oil of 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile. A 1 mile cubed block of oil. That's how much oil is taken out of the earth every year and burned. Now, what does it take to even come close to having a commensurate amount of oil like that? Well, you could build 900. It's actually 9. I think it's 9.1 million solar panels every year for 50 years to equal 1 year of burned oil energy. You could also 32.5 million turbines, wind turbines built. 32,500 wind turbines built every year for 50 years would equal 1 year of oil. 52 nuclear power plants built every year for 50 years would equal 1 year of oil. And, of course, 102 coal-fired coal plants creating electricity built every year for 50 years. That would give you the same power that oil gives us right now. Obviously, there's nothing out there on the horizon that's going to equal the energy release of oil. So we're in a lot of trouble on that thing, Richard, and
That's right.
I hope that was really made clear by those comparisons.
And it's so easily to solve. Just stop having so many children.
That's correct. Well, and stop having so much mass immigration.
That's right,
because, again, the mass immigration is not going to solve the fact that the third world keeps adding 80 million new babies net gain every year.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's their, what's the word for the way they believe, that they should need to keep reproducing. That's what's wrong.
It's unlimited fecundity, birth rates, and it's encouraged by the Islamic, all these older religions.
Right.
Certainly the Hindus, certainly the Buddhists, certainly the Islamists, certainly the Christians, the Catholic Church.
Right.
And that's the great tragedy. And the fact is, and in fact, I'm going to quote this from Dr. Otis Graham. He wrote Unguarded Gates, and he said, and I quote, "Most Western elites continue urging the wealthy West not to stem the migrant tide that adds 80 million net gain annually to the planet, but to absorb our global brothers and sisters until their horrid ordeal has been endured and shared by all of us, 10 billion humans packed on an ecologically devastated planet, unquote.
Now that's a sarcastic thing, isn't it?
Well, it's a fact. I mean,
Okay.
he
Oh,
said
yes.
it in his book, and I've met Dr. Otis Graham, and the fact is, if we keep adding all of these immigrants to our country, and I would ask all of you to go to numbersusa.org. Roy Beck has 2 videos. One is a 5-minute video showing you how fast, through this gumball machine, he's got gumballs in these vases, and you can see how fast the third world is adding the 80 million net gain per year. So no matter, even if the Western countries took on 10 million a year or 15 or 20 or 30 million a year, it would never solve the third world's addition of 80 million net gain every year. So you can see it simply is not a way to solve the population crisis. What we have to do is stop immigrating so that these leaders of these countries are forced to deal with their populations, because at some point there's no way that Western countries can survive and be the exhaust pipe for all these countries, and so they're going to have to deal with them anyway. It's better to do it sooner than later, because if we do it later, we all become victims. If we do it sooner, then we can actually create our own civilization to be viable and sustainable through the 21st century.
That's right. And there's so many other factors to do with the nationalities and religions that you mentioned that become a part of this. Everything is, it's so hard to reverse them, and we have to somehow, they have to keep being pointed out by, hopefully, their own people to do and reverse.
Well, you would hope that there's intelligent thought out there by all of these leaders, but the fact is, culture and religion overpower reasoned thought, critical thinking, rational action, and just luckily, here in the United States, the Catholic Church doesn't have a say, and virtually 99% of Catholics use birth control. In fact,
right.
Catholics in America use birth control more than Protestants do. But again, all religions and all people and all races in America have been averaging 2 children or less per family since 1970. So obviously intelligence and education have created that paradigm. The same is in Canada, and the same is in Europe, and the same is in Australia and places like New Zealand. But the rest of the world, as I said, continues to steam ahead with 80 million new babies net gain every year.
That's right. And I think in terms of, we're using 25% of the resources of the world. That's just one more thing that creates a problem, especially for the United States. It's why Dr. Albert Bartlett,
correct,
the one of the, well, shall we say, one of us, that care about the future, said that you just can't keep going on like this.
Yeah, there's no question that exponential growth cannot continue. And he said in one of his great quotes, and I knew Dr. Bartlett for over 30 years. We dined together, we spoke together. He came to my programs, I came to his programs. And he said, name one thing on a global or a local level that will be improved by adding more and more humans. Will it make air pollution better and clean it up? Will it make water shortages better and give more water to everybody? Will it improve gridlock traffic? Will it improve the acidification of the oceans? Will it stop the garbage buildup and the plastic that's being tossed into the oceans to create the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? And of course, the answer is no.
Never.
There's
right.
nothing that's going to improve as you keep adding more people, but in fact, it's going to get worse. And here's the quote by Dr. Bartlett. And for those of you who want to follow Dr. Bartlett, and he's passed away now 2 years, www.albartlett.org. That's albartlett.org. And he said, and I quote, "Can you think of any problem in any area of human endeavor on any scale from microscopic to global whose long-term solution is in any demonstrable way aided, assisted, or advanced by further increases of population locally, nationally, or globally," unquote. And of course the answer is
never.
Never. There's no chance for it. And as a matter of fact, I've also met Dr. Paul Ehrlich at Stanford University.
Oh, yeah.
And he is beyond brilliant himself. And he said, and that's why I bring this up, all causes are lost causes without limiting human population, unquote. And that's why, whether it's the Sierra Club or it's the Audubon Society or it's Greenpeace or the Sea Shepherd Society or the National Bluebird Society or the World Wildlife Society or any and all of these organizations that are purporting to save the environment, all of their causes are ultimately lost if we don't stabilize and, in fact, decline human population, because we are really so far in over our heads right now that the Faustian bargain is going to come down on our children's heads, if not sooner, and cause extraordinary consequences that, as I've said, will be irreversible and unsolvable.
You know, these are huge numbers.
Oh,
but
huge.
the 7 billion that we have now, we really, I mean, to make it round numbers, we need to get it down to 1 billion. And when we bring in 1 billion people in a 12-year period, that's just too much. We have to go back. We got to do something to bring that back to where we were. Planet can't sustain us. There just isn't enough planet.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, Dr. Jack Alpert, again, who is absolutely brilliant, he said that we in order to maintain what we're doing to the planet right now, this deficit spending, if you will, on energy and water and resources, we would have to have 3 planets
right.
if we're going to survive. Well, folks, we don't have 3 planets. We've only got one, and it's getting used up and abused and burned up and hydrocarboned up and 70,000 chemicals and chemicalized up now is such a horrendous rate of speed. And you'll see all the reports. I mean, it's like California last year, because of drought, lost 12 million trees, and the year before it lost 12 million trees. And you can look this up. These are facts that have been shown. I've just read them in the in the LA Times and so forth when I was going through. But 90% of the monarch butterflies of California have died off because of Roundup, a weed killer brought to us by Monsanto. And that company doesn't care what it does to the environment, whether it's GMOs or whether it's the Roundup or Weed Be Gone or any of the chemicals that it goes out and kills the natural world. And so either we take action or those in power will continue to usurp the natural world and create the consequences that we're all going to be facing, especially our children.
Bend over and pick the weed out of your driveway.
Exactly.
That's really
pick the weed.
all you need to do.
That's all you need to do. You just pick the weeds yourself.
And don't buy Roundup. It just it'll come back and haunt us.
Well, as a matter of fact, Boulder, Colorado was the first city, which is north of me by about 40 miles. Boulder, Colorado was the first city in the United States to ban Roundup and all weed killers from sale there in Boulder, Colorado. I'm hoping more and more. Just go down to your own city council, and you can get all the information from the Boulder City Council. Just write them, bouldercolorado.com. You'll get the city council. You'll get the ordinance that they created. Create the same ordinance in your own city all over America. Let's start a new trend. Also, www.justlabel.it.org. Justlabel.it.org passed in Vermont last year, and Vermont now in July will be the first state to literally show the people that anything that's a GMO, and it will be labeled because the governor signed it. And right now, though, of course, Monsanto is suing the state of Vermont for some reason because they don't want to have the GMOs labeled. And the reason for that is because when GMOs are labeled and people know what they're putting into their children's bodies, they won't buy GMOs. Most Americans don't realize when they're buying GMOs, but GMOs are in just about everything, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or 90% of the corn you're eating or 80% of the what is it, soy that you're eating. We now have GMO salmon. These things are grave consequences to the world, killing the pollinators off, and things like weed be gone, and then you have the GMO grains and corn that are meant to withstand the Roundup itself, which is a chemical. So there's chemicals inside of the corn kernels and the wheat kernels and so forth. So you can see this thing's getting very complicated, and it's destroying the natural world. And have your state literally have a GMO labeling so we can stop the really amoral CEO and his colleagues there at Monsanto, because they don't care about you or your children or the natural world.
That's right. Just for example, lobsters, we had to have a complete stop on the fishing of certain things here on the Oregon coast. That just had to be because of toxicity. And they said you can't do it. You just can't feed the lobsters to people. There's too much going on with them.
That's correct. Well, even in the Chesapeake Bay, right there on the East Coast, the Chesapeake Bay, you can't eat the oysters from the Chesapeake Bay because they're so poisoned. And the same thing holds true in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico has been poisoned by that oil well, and all that oil is just sliding around the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and slowly dissipating. But you also have the Mississippi River, which, by the way, folks, I have paddled the Mississippi River from the beginning in Lake Itasca, where it was only 6 feet across and 12 inches deep, then turns into a 2,552-mile river, and then opens into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's so loaded with chemicals and fertilizers and phosphates and sewage and trash and garbage and filth and chemicals of all kinds, fertilizer runoff, pesticide runoff, you name it. There's a 10,000 square mile dead zone right there at the mouth of the Mississippi. Can you imagine what that will magnify to with the addition of another 100 million immigrants to this country and a total population load? And let me make this clear. That 438 million won't stop if we don't stop it by mass immigration. And again, numbersusa.org, the two videos is Immigration, Poverty, and Gumballs by Roy Beck should be seen by every American. It's 5 minutes long. And then Immigration Off the Charts shows what it's going to look like when we go to, instead of just the 324 million, we'll blow past 438 million, and we'll reach 625 million within the lifetime of a child today. Do you want that kind of a future for your children?
The garbage patch, is that like the one in the Pacific? That's also in the off Louisiana.
Oh, yeah. Let me really have you appreciate that just 20 miles off of San Francisco back in 1947 or so, the U.S. military and the nuclear age dumped, I think it was 500 drums of radioactive waste. And just several years ago, NPR went out and showed where, and it had scuba divers go down there, which is, I'm sitting there going, holy catfish, that's radioactive waste, and you're doing what you're doing. They found all of the drums, the 55-gallon barrel drums, had all opened up and had released all of the nuclear waste into the Pacific, but also into the East Coast and also into the Caribbean there in the Gulf of Mexico. After World War II, they released all of the mustard gas and lucite. Those two gases that were used to paralyze people in World War II were released in specific point, and you can look it up. Just look up for the mustard gas release and the lucite after World War II. It's right there on Google. You can find it. And then think of all of the Fukushima with all the hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive waste coming from there. That's now circulated around the world. And then if you add what the Russians have done with all of their nuclear waste, and possibly the North Koreans and any nuclear country, you know that nuclear waste is going into the water systems, it's going are poisoning our world at a prodigious rate of speed, and with more population, it can only accelerate that poisoning of the planet.
We haven't even talked about Fukushima yet, but I know from what you've seen and talked about that it's all over the world.
It's all over the world. That is a fact. There's no way to get around it because the world's oceans all circulate into each other, and so Fukushima is now all over the world.
There's no other way to get around it. It's
no.
So there's a garbage patch down in Louisiana in the Caribbean.
Well, let me give you some because I did a story on this, and I did a 15-part story on overpopulation, and I talked about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is it was 15 years ago when Oprah Winfrey came out with an expose on it. Was a giant floating garbage dump of plastic, styrofoam, plastic containers, you name it, floating 1,000 miles off of San Francisco between two of the Pacific gyres. You can call them gyres, you call them gyres, but these are circular patterns that then push all of the plastic into one giant area, and it's the size of Texas, and it's anywhere from 30 to 60, in some places 90 feet deep, just a giant floating island of plastic, all coagulated together, kills millions of seabirds, millions of marine animals, kills, over 100 million sharks are killed every year by humans. 100 million. You can look that up on One Earth by Julia Whitty. And even Life magazine in 1991 talked about 100 million sharks being killed every year. And so you see this damage is horrific, but it's also in the Atlantic. It's also, I've scuba dived in all of the oceans of the world, so I've seen the progression of plastics by my own eyes. And the fact is, the Mediterranean has giant, plastic islands. The Atlantic has it. The Indian Ocean has it. And on average, and this is, you can look it up, on average, 46,000 plastic containers float on every square mile of our oceans all over the world right now. And the statistics that I read last year showed that 2.5 million containers are being thrown into the oceans every hour, 24/7, to keep adding to it. And so you can see the consequences continue to grow exponentially.
That was the containers that you were pushing for a deposit.
That's correct. An international deposit return law of 25 cents per plastic container. That's what is desperately needed because the human race is doing devastating consequences to the natural world, not only at the top level, but also down in the oceans where plastics are just literally rolling around on reefs, killing sharks. The big 50-mile-long drift nets are cut loose, and those things just keep killing those marine life, suffocating them, killing them, ensnaring them, and they die. And then of course the other animals come to eat them, and then they get caught in the nets and they die. It's a nasty killing machine what humans have created on the oceans of the world.
It's funny. I was just listening to the radio today, and somebody said something about a credit card, and I thought, there's billions of credit card parts down in the oceans around there.
That's right, everywhere.
You just talk about one. You're just talking about one. Now that they're all over. They're everywhere.
Oh, Bic lighters, toothbrushes, every kind of plastic.
Right.
Glasses, plastic, sunglasses, plastic baby diapers, soiled baby diapers. And as a matter of fact, I pick up a lot of trash. I've probably picked up 500,000 pieces of trash on 6 continents in my lifetime. And today, I was picking up a rest area for truckers. And boy, they have a nasty habit of peeing in these gallon bottles or even quart bottles, and then they throw that into the rest areas. And unfortunately, I have gloves. I take care of myself. But I pick up all of the pee bottles and all the trash and all the garbage. But around the world, the human race is just throwing all of this godforsaken plastic trash everywhere on the land and the water and the oceans and the lakes. And there's just no return laws that are doing anything effectively to stop it, and so it's going to continue.
Well, anyway, from what we're trying to talk about is there's still birth control methods that people need to be aware of and put in place, and that's just as important part of our talking about. There's too many people all the time, but we need to say, stop thinking about having so many children. By the way, one of my things that always got me is parents that tell their grown children who are going to get married, hey, how soon can we have a grandchild? And I'm thinking, please just don't have any children. Don't try to do anything like that. And everybody wants to keep expanding, going on and on like that. So I'm saying, think about every kind of birth control that you can think of, every way to cut down on the population that you're going to be involved in. And that's the way to make some progress here.
Well, that's correct. And the one thing that I would ask everyone, again, empower yourself. Such organizations as David Durham out in California, www.carryingcapacity.org. There's also www.capsweb.org with Joanne Weidman. That's capsweb.org. That's Californians for Population Stabilization, which is an international organization, very powerful.
Okay.
You also have, of course, the ability to push international family planning with Norplant. Norplant is a 5-year birth control that gets inserted into a woman by her choice, and that will keep her from having babies for 5 years until she's old enough to make intelligent choices. There's obviously birth control pills, which are another aspect. Again, skill.org is powerful. FAIR, FAIRUS.org, Federation for American Immigration Reform. Join these organizations because they're already at like 4 or 5 million. We need 10 million Americans so that you empower yourself to empower these organizations to get those videos out, and so that we can get a national discussion, because all of us are not powerful at all. But when you join numbersusa.org and carryingcapacity.org and capsweb.org, you are joining groups that are just powerful and rational and educated and compelling and run by some people that I respect highly. And again, 60m@cbsnews.com. Tell them that you'd like to have Frosty Wooldridge speak on overpopulation. Who else but a man who's ridden a bicycle over 150,000 miles across 6 continents and seen the consequences? You need to have speakers like yours truly. You need to have speakers like Dan Stein, Joanne Weidman, Dr. Diana Hull, Kathleen Parker, certainly a Roy Beck, who is absolutely brilliant. The key is, and then David Durham, there's a David Paxson at worldpopulationbalance.org. We have to get this conversation, this debate, this discussion to the very highest levels of the media here in this country. On NPR, we've got to get to Robert Siegel. We've got to get to Terry Gross. If you go to the websites on Facebook, you'll see my Facebook page, Frosty Wooldridge, on Facebook. I write Terry Gross weekly with my columns, and you'll see my columns on my Facebook page. I flat tell Terry Gross. I've sent her personal letters. I've sent letters to Leanne Hansen. I've sent them to Steve Inskeep and Robert Siegel, and they won't do anything because they don't get enough information or response from American citizens. So each of you take advantage of what we're sharing with you tonight and in further interviews, and get this thing to the forefront of the country so that we can have a viable and sustainable future for all of our kids. And this is black, white, brown, red, or yellow. We're all in this together. This whole issue has nothing to do with race. It doesn't have to do with color. It has nothing to do with creed or ethnic group.
Politics.
It has to do with all of us surviving in a viable civilization.
Nothing to do with politics either.
It doesn't have anything to do with politics either. That's right.
We're going to push each other off the edge of the earth if we don't do something. And all we have to do is just cut down on the number of people.
That's correct.
that by not having them born, people have to realize you can't go on and have a family. You just think in terms of, at the very most, one child, preferably none. Right now, it's more of a crisis from the standpoint of having so many people on Earth.
Well, that's correct. And Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, said this, and this will put a chill up your spine. He said, and I'm quoting, "The U.S. will set a record in the rate of rise and fall of an empire. Between wide-open borders and the fall of the dollar and growing population against a declining resource base, the U.S. will be defeated from within. Mobs will rule the streets in a nation that is now the third largest and fastest growing country in the world and unable to support its population except by taking resources from other countries," unquote. The fact is we can't even survive with all the other countries, but at some point they won't be able to survive to even give us their resources. We import 7 of 10 barrels of oil every day right now. And so Arnold Toynbee, the historian, sure gives us a chilling, if you knew you were a citizen on Easter Island and you had children, wouldn't you want to change the course of Easter Island's history or the Mayan Empire or certainly the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire? All these great empires fell because they simply overloaded their carrying capacity and could not sustain their citizens inside and within themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Frosty, I want to thank you very much for calling in and providing this great conversation. I just had to take a moment to go back to my newspaper here. City choked by traffic congestion. It means city choked by overpopulation. People need to start using different words when they say not having so many children and just doing something. But in any event, I want to thank our crew. And could you go ahead and put up the schedule for replay, and that'll take care of us for this part. Oh yeah, great. Okay. And thanks again, Frosty, 'cause I think that was great.
My pleasure. It's this last quote is by Dr. Albert Bartlett.
Go ahead.
"Unlimited population growth cannot be sustained. You cannot sustain growth in the rates of consumption of resources. No species can overrun the carrying capacity of a finite landmass. This law cannot be repealed and is not negotiable," unquote.
Do people understand that the end of the earth is not negotiable? We're just there. Well, okay, I think we've gotten to the end of and we're going to go, the second portion will be